direction, but
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like on the tip top of the world.
So, the government is maybe, probably, who knows, about to shut down the United States government. But do you know what that means? What does that mean for trade? What does that mean for ocean shipping? And while we're talking about the government, let's do a quick refresher on what an independent regulatory commission is. I always say that the Federal Maritime Commission is an independent regulatory commission. Do you remember what that means? We've talked about it a little bit, but let's just hit it straight on. Did you know that the Federal Maritime Commission is an independent regulatory commission? I say it so quickly. Have you ever thought about what that means? Hi, welcome by Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics, the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, well, the first story here is just a continuation. We still have those 3 rulemakings that we're watching, and we have one open RFI, request for information. So as a reminder, I'm not going to do this every week. Last year, I put this on my weekly until we get some information. I just want to kind of keep it top of mind for everybody as everyone's kind of getting back into it. And let's not forget about these 3 rulemakings. So as a reminder, these 3 are defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations provided by an ocean common carrier. Who else can say that whole long title in their sleep at this point? We also have billing practices and detention and demurrage, and we also are waiting on any language about defining unfair and unjustly discriminatory methods, although the FMC is saying that they kind of loop that into the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. Okay, all right, so that's good, but we haven't seen any standalone language. So we did get a little bit of an update last week. I talked about it. It was part of the FMC's commission hearing meeting, or commission meeting, where they were talking about the updates and status of all the OSBA rulemakings. Essentially, the D&D, they had over 180 comments come in last winter, but apparently they're still reviewing comments. They're still having comments come in. They had substantive comments that came in within the past month. I do love that the FMC tends to take late filed comments. They don't have to, but they certainly tend to, it seems. And when they're substantive, meaning like there's some actual meat on the bones there, they want to make sure that they're responding, and they didn't want to miss the opportunity, is what my take from the update was. So they're still reviewing. Look, we're also up against a government shutdown here, right? So perhaps that was part of it. But they said that they did receive substantive comments in the past month, so they're still reviewing and putting together the comments. The final text is what we're waiting on. I'm expecting that this detention and demurrage billing practices rule will be a final text. Commissioner Dye did remind the basically anybody who was listening, but certainly the Office of the General Counsel, that part of what Congress also mandated was that there be a review of the interpretive rule. And also I'd like to just kind of add in the 13 invoicing requirements that Congress had put out there. So there's still some moving pieces on this one. This is I guess I'd say it's a balance, because we want to make sure we get it right, as Chairman Maffei has always said, but also we want to make sure that we get it out there for the industry to start using. I've reported before that the industry already has been making some changes based on some of that initial early text out of the detention and demurrage in that notice of proposed rulemaking. But until we get the final rule, it really doesn't have the teeth like it does, otherwise. So we're still waiting on that. Unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate, that one I'm giving a little bit of a pass to, because they are reviewing the comments that were filed for the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. So again, we had a notice of proposed rulemaking that was last winter. That one opened back up. They wanted more comments, more reaction, more industry input. So they opened it back up for the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. That closed July 31st, so just, 2 months ago. So they're reviewing the comments and drafting the the final rule for that one as well. The third one, I've been pretty critical of this, but the unfair, unjust, and discriminatory methods, the defining that. What the FMC said at that meeting, the recent meeting last week, was that the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking started to loop in some of the unfair, unjust, and discriminatory methods in that unreasonable refusal of cargo space. The General Counsel reported that they are finalizing the proposed rule for the remaining sections of that OSRA requirement. So they're basically saying we're kind of biting this one in chunks, and they already took a bite out of this one and put it over in the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, which again was the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. Clear as mud, right? Don't worry. I'm with you. I'm keeping it all straight. I'm making sure that we get these rules, that I'll digest them. I'll break them down for you. I have a couple old episodes where we break down some of these rules, some of the proposed text. I go through some of the comments that were filed on some of these in the past. Keep engaged here, especially with that supplemental notice of proposed the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. That one had less comments, but certainly not less important. That one, there's so much in there that can make some pretty big changes in the industry that I want to make sure, especially the definitions, people are paying attention. And look, like I said, we also have a request for information, an RFI that we're watching. That's from the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative from Commissioner Carl Bensel's office. He has proposed a few questions that were broken down by stakeholder that are in that RFI, and he's asking for either specific answers to those questions or just basic feedback or comments about the MTDI recommendations and views report. That came out a while ago at this point. So one quick administrative kind of website point, though, if you are trying to go look for this RFI, it's a little tricky to find on the FMC website specifically. So if you go over to the MTDI page, which is where they kind of have everything, the landing page for MTDI, you can find that from the main page, the fmc.gov homepage. But what you can't find is the RFI on that MTDI page, or certainly not easily, because it's not one of the first things that pops up. So what I usually do when I go look for the RFI and I try to get over to the regulations.gov, which is where whenever you have a comment and notice period, the FMC has moved over to the regulations.gov system. So they don't collect all those comments in-house. They send them over to that regulations.gov, much easier platform. And I'm sure it helps on the back end for the FMC side. But you won't find that RFI on that MTDI page. You will find it on Commissioner Carl Bensel's web page. So each commissioner has their own web page too. So if there's kind of initiatives that the commissioners are taking independently that isn't the full FMC, that's a trick. That's where you can go find them. They have their own comments or related articles or current events section. You can go find the RFI in the regulations.gov link there under Commissioner Bensel's webpage. So it's the About section. It's under the if you scroll over to the commissioners and then you scroll over to the specific commissioner, Commissioner Bensel, then down at the bottom of the page, you can find the related article section. Perhaps that'll be referenced back to the actual MTDI landing page. But for now, that's where I usually find it. And then just bookmark that regulations.gov. They haven't received any comments yet, but don't worry. It's open until October 16th. We still have, almost 3 weeks left. I'm going to put a little fire. I'm going to say just over 2 weeks. So that way, in case you are thinking about submitting comments, know that the clock is ticking, right? So look, stay tuned here. I'm going to keep watching all of the rulemakings. I'm going to make sure that we get some clarity, that the industry understands what's happening and what's coming from the Federal Maritime Commission. As always, I like breaking it down, making sure that it kind of makes some sense. So that's where we're at. We're still waiting to get more information here. We did not get the releases of the text that I thought we might with the commission meeting last week, but that's okay. That's all right. We did get a little information, but I'm still anxious to see what happens next. All right, story number 2. So we're talking all about this government, everything that's happening, the shutdown. Is there going to be a shutdown? I think so, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm being pessimistic here. We've been here before, but it seems like we're here again. Look, without getting too far into the politics of it all, it seems like there's two pretty major stalling issues. One is funding on Ukraine, and the other's on border security and funding of the border. And those are kind of one's on the House side, one's on the Senate side. They both have to pass a bill, come together, and move forward. And then the president ultimately has to sign it for us to not have a government shutdown. Here we are. It's Friday, September 29th. We have until tomorrow, Saturday, September 30th, by midnight, for not just the bills to be passed, but for the president to sign it. And look, maybe if he signs it at 1 a.m., that's fine. Or, we still avoid a shutdown. But look, I don't know. It looks like we're kind of gearing up for maybe a few days, but we still have 1.5 full days here to get some work done. But it looks like my guess would be that we'd probably be shut down for a couple days, maybe even a couple weeks. I mean, we've had that before. We've had a couple weeks shut down before. Look, so for those who haven't been familiar with the shutdown before, who weren't really paying attention maybe last time, or maybe who didn't have any reason to kind of understand the operations or the specifics of what happens during a shutdown, I can share a little bit of my experience. I was working for the federal government, at least on, one shutdown, one actual shutdown, one almost shutdown. It's a pretty tense time, but it's almost like, is it tense for political purposes or is it tense for real purposes for the actual federal employee? Look, it's both, right? So the budget stalemate, like I said, needs to be solved before midnight on Saturday, September 30th. Otherwise, shutdown procedures go into place. And in my experience, we were actually still required to show up as federal employees, non-essential federal employees, to the office the next workday after the shutdown. Some offices made it so that it would kind of automatically go into effect. And what I mean by would go into effect is we had to show up to set our out of office message for our emails. We had to show up to set our out of office voicemails, basically saying due to a lack of funding or a lapse of funding, the agency that you're working for has ceased operations for the time being. Look, it's not for a lack of wanting to work, right? These federal employees do want to work. And sure, for the first day or two, it feels like a nice snow day. But at the time, there's no guarantee. And certainly there was at that time, no guarantee of back pay for government employees. I believe in the meantime, Congress has actually passed a resolution. I think it was shortly after the last shutdown that guaranteed back pay for federal employees. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a shutdown that hasn't had the back pay filled to the federal employees. But look, that's back pay, right? So you have to show back, you have to have operations restart. The government has to restart. And then you get paid. But look, bills don't always have a delay option either, right? Which is kind of why they liked, which is kind of why I've heard in the past when we had the few week shutdown that it wasn't going to go beyond a month, because then that's when you really start to mess with some of the federal employees, mortgage payments, rent payments, any of those monthly bills. You make your point in the couple weeks and then you don't affect everybody. They still cost a lot of money, right? These are still very costly to the federal government, these shutdowns. So anyways, that's what it was for me on the last one, right? We showed up, we set our out of office, and then we left with no good information on when we'd return. And we weren't allowed to work. We weren't allowed to return until operations had resumed and there was appropriated funds for the government to return. And that's all due to the Anti-Deficiency Act, which, if I remember correctly, has criminal ramifications if it's broken, meaning that if any government employee not otherwise approved as an essential worker, and so I'll talk about that in a second, if any non-essential worker was found working or somehow doing activities on behalf of the government or in their capacity as a government employee, and they weren't approved for that, they would be breaking the Anti-Deficiency Act, and they'd be, potentially in big trouble. So who are the essential employees? Well, look, you're not going to see all the airports shut down, right? You're not going to see the FAA controllers shut down. You're not going to see food inspections shut down. You're not going to see kind of any of those major areas that are connected to safety or security right away anyways, right? And any agency that does have prior appropriated funds that they draw from, they're not shut down. Well, they might be shut down, but they still have their funds. So usually that's areas of the military. Usually that's some grant funded programs. So if there's kind of an anomaly and you see that there's emails coming through from an agency or a program that you didn't think would be otherwise classified as essential, maybe that's what's happening there. It might be that they had some appropriated funds in kind of a slush fund, or no, I shouldn't say slush fund, like a grant program or some sort of appropriated funding collective. So that also can happen. But look, those are kind of the anomalies, right? There's a lot of federal employees who are going to just be sent home should the government fully shut down. And really, for example, that's the Federal Maritime Commission. If I remember correctly, it was only the commissioners themselves that were actually allowed to continue working, but their staff and certainly their councils, if like I said, if I kind of remember all of this, weren't necessarily working. They were part of the shutdown. So what does that mean for the Federal Maritime Commission? There's a few people still there, but look, it's kind of a shutdown agency. And so what does that mean? That means some of the licensing is shut down, or at least partially. Applications, any of the adjudications, right? That I think right off the bat, the dockets usually send out a little note that says this is halted, or this is suspended for the time being until appropriations return. So, I mean, it is pretty disruptive, right? There are some pretty major things that all of these agencies do, but not least of which the FMC. And so how does that connect to what we were talking about before? The rulemakings will only be paused further. I actually don't know if regulations.gov still accepts comments because it's all kind of an automated portal. That'll be interesting. Maybe I'll go check that on Monday or Sunday to see if that has changed. But yeah, so look, unfortunately, it looks like we are probably staring down a government shutdown that would begin Sunday. I guess in actuality, it would begin for the work week on Monday. Maybe it gets resolved before Monday starts. We'll see. But for our international friends who have maybe not paid attention or watched a government shutdown, things still happen. The country itself doesn't completely come to a halt. But some of these other very important but non-essential, so anything kind of like outside of the safety or security or any of those areas, is pretty much going to be stopped. And so you might not hear from your government friends for a little while. But hopefully it doesn't last too long if it does happen. All right, so story number 3. I just wanted to do a quick little follow-up to our discussion last week of the FIT Alliance and their Electronic Bill of Lading Declaration, the EBL. Remember, the FIT Alliance is the Future International Trade Alliance, and that's made up of DCSA, the Digital Container Shipping Association, BIMCO, FIATA, the International Chamber of Commerce, and SWIFT. SWIFT is banking. And look, they're reporting that they've actually already had 68 companies spanning all of shippers, carriers, solutions providers, banks, sign on to their EBL declaration. So 68 companies already. And so what do they signal by signing on to the EBL, Electronic Bill of Lading Declaration? They signal the signatories' commitment to collaborate to drive digitalization in the international trade. And obviously, it's really connected to the EBL, the Electronic Bill of Lading. You can actually look more into this yourself if you want. Check out which companies have endorsed. They don't have all 68 up there. Some of them actually have written commitments, written comments, written testimony. That's part of their declaration, if you will. So go check it out. I'm going to put the link in the show notes. So that's all on the FIT Alliance website. So pretty interesting. I'll keep watching all this. I think this movement towards digitization, EBL is really promising. There's a lot happening. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day then, right? So let's chat independent regulatory commissions and agencies. So what is an independent regulatory commission? We've talked a little bit about this before. Like I said at the outset, I always mention the Federal Maritime Commission is an independent regulatory commission. It rolls so easily, it rolls so quickly, but what does it mean? So an independent agency that's created through statute, so essentially created by Congress. And the independent regulatory agency, the independent agency, would be created to regulate and oversee a specific industry or sector. They are independent of the executive branch of government. So that means that they are independent of the president's office. They're not going to be part of those cabinet level agencies. They are independent, as the name suggests. But the independence is intended to operate truly free from the political influence, and that's why they're independent. That's why they're not part of changes of administration. That's why they're not part of this cabinet level collection. So like I said, what does all this mean exactly? It sounds pretty straightforward, but how does it all work? How can they keep it politically neutral and absent of political influence? Like, it's not entirely political neutral, but I'll kind of explain it. Let's start with something we know so that we can kind of tie these two things that we're familiar with. So let's start with the Federal Maritime Commission, the independent regulatory agency, and MARAD. MARAD is part of Department of Transportation, a cabinet level agency. So like I said, FMC is the independent federal regulatory agency. MARAD, the Maritime Administration, is an agency within Department of Transportation, one of the administration's cabinet level agencies. So Secretary Pete Buttigieg is the Secretary of Department of Transportation, and the Maritime Administration has a maritime administrator, which is Admiral Phillips. Ann Phillips. She is in charge, and she's put there as part of MARAD. Whereas the Federal Maritime Commission has 5 commissioners, one being the chairman. So let's keep jumping into this. And it's not going to necessarily be a comparison of FMC and MARAD. We've certainly done that before with by land and by sea. But I wanted to kind of jump into the FMC and just anchor it with an agency that you might also be familiar with. And how is it different? Because a lot of people might not be so in tune with the fact that FMC and MARAD not only are not the same agency, but the differences between. So if you wanted the deeper dive on the difference, go check out the past episode, but I'll kind of keep highlighting it here as we explain the independent nature of the FMC. So the FMC is the independent, I can't say it enough, right? Now your ears are going to ring every time you hear somebody saying independent. The FMC is the independent regulatory agency, and they're charged with regulating the movement of ocean-borne cargo for the benefit of the U.S. exporter, importer, and U.S. consumer. So I'm going to say that again. They're charged with regulating the movement of ocean-borne cargo, but through the lens for the benefit of the U.S. exporter, importer, and U.S. consumer. We hear a lot about U.S. exports, which are U.S. goods being shipped out, but it's also for the benefit of the U.S. importer and the U.S. consumer generally. So it is independent, right? That's important to know. And it's this independent nature that really allows it to be insulated from those political changes in administration. So how does it happen, right? The president can appoint the chairman of the FMC. So there's 5 commissioners. The president appoints the chairman. Who of those commissioners becomes the chairman of the FMC? But the president can't set the entire commission lineup by themselves. And I say the president, it's the presidential administration. The commissioners are on 5-year staggered terms, which actually works out great because there's 5 commissioners, 5-year staggered terms. They're allowed to hold over sometimes. And so while those easy 5-year staggered terms might not turn into the actual day that the commissioner might be leaving, should they have, excuse me, should they expend or get to the end of their term, but the term itself still stays on that 5-year staggered term schedule. So they are nominated by the president, but they must be confirmed by the Senate. And that only happens when one of the terms is up. And contrast that with MARAD, there's only the one person in charge, right? Like I said, so it's not the commission of 5 commissioners, with one being the chairman. There's an executive hierarchy with the maritime administrator, Ann Phillips, as the lead. The role of maritime administrator does change with the administration changes. So an important note about the independent agencies is that the president, executive office, can only make recommendations to the agencies. So what does that mean? So in the case of the FMC, they can only make, the president's or the administration can only make recommendations. They can't direct or demand the Federal Maritime Commission or any other independent agency to actually do something. We've seen that a few times where there will be a directive, an executive order that comes out from the president's office, and it'll go through all these different agencies saying Department of Transportation must, Maritime Administration of Department of Transportation must, Department of Commerce must, and then they'll go to the Federal Maritime Commission and say, the Federal Maritime Commission is encouraged or somehow a softer language, because it's a suggestion. They're not allowed to, or they can't direct or demand those independent agencies to do something because they're independent. I can't say it enough. Only Congress can do that. Only Congress can direct those agencies to act and do something. This is another way, this is truly the way that the FMC stay and all the other independent agencies stay insulated from those politics. It takes the entire Congress to pass something that directs one of these independent regulatory agencies to act like the FMC. And we actually just saw that happen last summer with the congressional passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. That's partly why that was such a big deal, because that's giving specific directive to an independent regulatory agency, and it took the entire Congress to pass it. That's both House and Senate to have it sent over to the independent regulatory agency, the Federal Maritime Commission, telling them to do something. So the FMC's mission statement is to ensure a competitive and reliable international ocean transportation supply system that supports the U.S. economy and protects the public from unfair and deceptive practices. Remember, at the outset, independent regulatory agencies are created to kind of protect an area, an industry. And that's sure exactly what the Federal Maritime Commission is here for too. Again, the mission statement: ensure a competitive and reliable international ocean transportation supply system that supports the U.S. economy and protects the public from unfair and deceptive practices. It's so important. I think that mission statements are often overlooked. The FMC specifically, but certainly elsewhere, really holds tight to their mission statement. And I think that it's important to pay attention to the mission statement as you try to maybe guess what the FMC might be doing next, because they really do try to connect their mission with their decisions. They want to make sure that they're ensuring a competitive and reliable, right? Sometimes you might see something that's clearly a competitive decision, but then they also want to make sure it's reliable. Just little clues on how to kind of make sure, or how to pay attention to where the FMC might go with some of their decisions as they continue on. There's a lot of stuff happening right in the ocean shipping world. Just a little tidbit to pay attention to. And again, reliable, competitive and reliable, that supports the U.S. economy and protects the public, right? So that's going to be probably the most important thing. You're going to see that throughout most of the independent regulatory agencies, but protects the public from unfair and deceptive practices. So look, MARAD, their language is more of a foster, promote, and develop. So essentially the FMC of the two, we go into this in further detail in a previous episode, but essentially the FMC is the regulatory arm, while MARAD is the promotional arm because of the language, right? MARAD is foster, promote, develop. FMC is protect, public, competitive. So they are more of that regulatory. Look, essentially you can't have the same entity regulating the industry also be giving out money in the form of grants and funding. And that's exactly the rationale that was behind splitting up the two agencies. Yes, that's right. I said these two agencies used to be one. Perhaps that's why people still get confused. I don't think so. But perhaps that's why people still get confused that MARAD and FMC are the same agency. They are not. They used to be, though. They collectively were known as the Federal Maritime Board, that was actually an agency within the Department of Commerce. I mean, the Department of Commerce is where NOAA, National Weather Service, Economic Development Administration, Patent Trade Office, those offices are over in the Department of Commerce. And the Federal Maritime Board used to be over there. But now, ever since 1961, the two agencies split and went their separate ways. MARAD went over to Department of Transportation, and FMC became what it is, the independent regulatory agency that it is today. And like I said, they were charged with regulating U.S. ocean commerce, and MARAD was formed to promote America's merchant marine and oversee an emergency reserve of cargo ships used for times of conflict. Two very different purposes. Sure, they overlap oftentimes, or I shouldn't even say often. Sure, they overlapped in certain times, but they are different. And I love that they kind of have those very specific, separate things that they have been charged with doing. So we've previously chatted about independent regulatory commissions beyond just the FMC. We talked about the Federal Trade Commission before. They, if you recall, had an open comment period for non-competes. Why is the Federal Trade Commission and non-competes coming into kind of freight discussion? Why did we talk about it? It found its way into the freight community's discussion because, at least in part, Steve Cox, president of Steam Logistics, was very open against against non-competes and very vocal about it, which was seemingly, it seems, supported by most of the freight industry. But I don't want to broad brush stroke it. It just became a very a very discussed topic in the freight world, and so we certainly talked about it here as well. So the Federal Trade Commission, like the Federal Maritime Commission, is also an independent regulatory commission. The FTC, as you probably heard it more often called, it is a commission, so it's not an executive branch agency. Also independent, they also have commissioners. They actually have 5 commissioners, but they serve 7-year terms. And so it looks like they actually only had, last check, about 4 commissioners. So they have just over majority of the well, they have 4 out of the 5. So which is fine, which can happen, right? If sometimes the administrations don't always go back and fill all of those commissioner openings that are out there. So what does the FTC do? Like I said, I love going into a good mission statement. Their mission statement says protecting the public from deceptive or unfair business practices. Sound familiar? And from unfair methods of competition through law enforcement, advocacy, research, and education, which says to me that they probably have major offices for all 4 of those areas. They have probably law enforcement, right? The FMC has the same. It's a Bureau of Enforcement, or Office of Enforcement now. Advocacy, research, and education. Those areas are probably more subsumed in other departments within the Federal Maritime Commission. You might see them, I mean, probably research and education. Certainly the education part would be in the Consumer Affairs and Dispute Resolution. Rough apples to apples-ish here. So the vision of FTC, because I love a good kind of strategic plan that outlines the mission, vision, and strategic goals. The vision is a vibrant economy fueled by fair competition and an empowered, informed public. So it gives you a little glimpse of what their intentions are as an entire agency. That's for the Federal Trade Commission. And their strategic goals are 1, protect the public from unfair or deceptive acts or practices in the marketplace. 2, protect the public from unfair methods of competition in the marketplace and promote fair competition. And 3, advance the FTC's effectiveness and performance. So look, this all sounds pretty similar to the FMC, but without that industry specific language, right? So the FMC is obviously ocean shipping, oceanborne cargo, where the FTC is trade, but more generally. Look, these commissions, they're big deals, right? And they're independent, so they're not really supposed to be beholden to the roller coaster of politics, especially with the FTC. That's interesting that they have the 7-year terms. It really makes sure that they are very insulated from the politics and that they will often see change of administration in one of those one of the 5 commissioners' 7-year terms. Again, like I said, the FMC only has 5-year terms for their commissioners, but they can re-up. I'm sure that's probably true with the FTC as well. So the FTC is the only federal agency with both consumer protection and competition jurisdiction in broad sectors of the economy. This is off their website. The FTC pursues vigorous and effective law enforcement, advances consumers' interests by sharing its expertise with federal and state legislatures and U.S. and international government agencies, develop policy and research tools through hearings, workshops, conferences, and creates practical and plain language education programs for consumers. I think this is something we're going to continue to see a lot of these independent agencies really connect with not only stakeholders, but the general public. They want to make sure that their work isn't being not ignored, but maybe not noticed. And it's important work, right? If these independent agencies are set up for the protection of an industry or a sector, it's important that they also let the public know that that's why they've been created, to be protective of that sector or that industry. The FTC was actually created in 1914. So unlike the FMC, which was 1961, like I said, when they split, the FTC was created in 1914 with a purpose to prevent unfair methods of competition in commerce as part of a battle to bust the trusts. So over the years, Congress passed additional laws giving the agency greater authority to police the anti-competitive practices. Like we said, now they have the law enforcement side, which is most likely their enforcement arm. So we're not going to go back into the proposed rule on banning non-competes, but I do want to remind you that's why we brought up the FTC. I did pull up their regulations.gov today. I didn't see any follow-up language or newly proposed rules or any final text. But admittedly, I haven't been following this as closely as others. But I did want to highlight a major difference between the FMC and the FTC. Obviously, despite both being similarly situated agencies and despite the FTC probably being a much larger agency, they probably don't have that 150 or less number of employees. Well, I know they don't. But another very stark difference. So the FMC's detention demurrage billing requirements rulemaking received over 180 comments. I mean, that was a huge success, right? 180 comments was a great success for the FMC to have that public engagement, to have that public awareness. The FTC on their non-compete rule, which, okay, the non-compete, it's across trades, it's across industries, had over 26,000 comments on their proposed rule. Imagine going through, that's a team of attorneys, I guarantee it, that are having to go through all of those comments and sift through them and find similarities and buckets so that they can appropriately respond. They obviously won't be responding to all 26,000 individual comments, but they will be bucketing them, just as the FMC likely will, into kind of categories of concerns and referencing specific comments as they comes up. But just an interesting, I don't know, comparison, right? 180, huge success, 26,000. That's a lot of comments. So just different categories of public attention, I suppose, right? It's not exactly apples to apples, non-competes versus detention and demurrage, but like I said, still interesting. So in case you're wondering what other independent regulatory agencies are out there, I mean, you're probably familiar with a few of these, but just to kind of go down the list, it's certainly in the U.S. Code if you want to know all of them. But the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, independent regulatory agency, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, basically anything that has a commission at the end of it, for the most part. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that's an independent regulatory agency. FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Federal Housing Finance Board, the Federal Maritime Commission, as we know, the Federal Trade Commission, as we know, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Mine Enforcement Safety and Health Review Commission. Mine Enforcement Safety and Health Review. Okay. The National Labor Relations Board, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, the Postal Rate Commission, and the one that you probably have heard the most that maybe didn't realize it was an independent regulatory agency as well, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And certainly these are designated by statute. So this list could change if future statutes create new agencies or commissions for independent regulatory authority. So that's it. Quick and dirty, right? It's just a quick summary of what is an independent regulatory agency. We went into probably a little bit more detail than we have in the past, but I wanted to make sure that you still kind of understood and we were all on the same page of what the difference is, the significance of it, and the importance of it. As we are about to be heading into an election year next year in the United States, it's important to kind of notice which agencies are part of kind of a larger political discussion and which ones aren't. And these independent regulatory agencies, for the most part, like to stay and are designated to stay insulated from the politics. So as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you do have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, and the general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know, comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and By Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and By Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, maritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.